I bought the mountain cabin specifically to get away from people who have opinions about my flower pots. Not permanently, I'm not antisocial, just selectively social, and the distinction matters when you're choosing real estate. The cabin sat at the edge of a pine forest with a lake view that made every problem feel appropriately small, and for a long time it delivered exactly what I had paid for. Quiet mornings, unscheduled weekends, and a complete absence of anyone monitoring my outdoor furniture placement. Then Melissa Grant became HOA president, and the quiet became something I had to actively defend. Melissa approached community governance the way certain people approach any position of authority, as confirmation of a hierarchy that had always existed in her mind and was now simply official. The notices started small, which is how these things always start. A letter about the angle of my driveway lights, which I read twice looking for the part where it became a real concern and never found it. A follow-up questioning a storage shed that had been approved years before she took office, as though her election had retroactively reopened every prior decision. Then landscaping warnings, fence maintenance reminders, a genuinely memorable letter about the positioning of my patio chairs that I still think about when I need proof that some people have too much time and a laminator. I developed a system. Read the letter, confirm it had no legal weight, file it, returned my coffee. That system worked until I left for a 7-day business trip. Before leaving, I arranged a short-term rental agreement with a professional organization that needed a private, secure location for a training exercise in the area. The arrangement was legitimate, documented, and entirely within my rights as a property owner. Signed agreement, defined dates, authorized personnel, clear terms. The cabin would be occupied by people who were supposed to be there, which seemed like a straightforward situation that required no announcement to anyone, least of all the woman who had written me a formal letter about patio furniture. 3 days into the trip, my neighbor called. He opened with a question rather than a greeting, which told me immediately that something had already happened. Did you give the HOA permission to enter your property? He had not asked whether they had knocked on the door or left a note. He had asked about entry, and the specific word choice carried all the information I needed to understand that the situation had moved past ordinary Melissa behavior into something categorically different. What he described had apparently unfolded over several days. Melissa had been circulating through the neighborhood telling residents she suspected rule violations at my cabin. Nobody could identify the violations she was referencing. Nobody had observed anything unusual. The cabin appeared, from every external perspective, to be a normal unoccupied mountain property doing nothing more threatening than existing on a lot that Melissa had apparently developed strong feelings about. None of this deterred her. She had constructed a certainty in her mind that something on my property required immediate investigation, and she was going to investigate with or without the legal authority to do so. She chose without, rather than contacting me. My number was in the HOA directory, reachable by anyone willing to make a 30-second phone call. She instructed maintenance workers to cut the lock on my front gate. Not a clerical error, not a miscommunication. A deliberate decision, given as a direct order, to physically breach the entrance to private property because the person giving the order had decided her suspicions outweighed my property rights. The chain came off the gate, and Melissa walked onto my land expecting to find whatever evidence her certainty had already decided was there. What she found instead were the authorized personnel from the training program, already inside, conducting the exercise they had been contracted to conduct in the secured, private space they had been contracted to use. They were professional, calm, and entirely accustomed to controlled environments. An HOA president who had just cut a lock and let herself onto property without announcement, authorization, or warning was not a controlled environment. The questions that followed were reasonable and immediate. Who were these visitors? What authority had they used to enter? Who had specifically authorized them to cut the lock and access a secure property? Melissa, who had arrived with the forward momentum of someone expecting to issue violations, found herself in the unfamiliar position of being the one answering questions rather than asking them. Witnesses who were present described the transition as remarkably fast, from commanding to defensive in the span of approximately one exchange. The personnel she had walked in on were not alarmed, but they were thorough, and thoroughness in that context was not working in her favor. By the time I landed and turned my phone back on, I had 17 text messages, 4 voicemails, and a level of neighborhood awareness about my property that I had never previously achieved or wanted. The story had moved through the community with the speed that stories achieve when they combine genuine misconduct with a satisfying element of immediate consequence. Neighbors who had quietly tolerated years of Melissa's enforcement style were suddenly animated, not because an inspection had failed. Property inspections, however annoying, exist within the realm of HOA authority when conducted properly, because someone representing the HOA had cut a physical lock on a private gate and walked onto private property without permission, consent, or legal standing. That is not an overzealous interpretation of community standards. That is trespassing with a bolt cutter. The emergency board meeting, held several days later, drew the highest attendance anyone could recall. Residents came with questions. Board members came with the uncomfortable expressions of people who had been in the room for decisions they were now being asked to defend publicly. Melissa presented her position, that she had acted to protect community standards, that her belief in a violation justified the investigation, that the HOA's responsibility to the neighborhood had required her to act. The bylaws, the property records, and 2 legal opinions the board had rushed to obtain all reached the same conclusion through different routes. She had possessed none of the authority she had exercised. HOA enforcement powers, even broadly interpreted, do not include the unilateral right to cut locks and enter private property based on personal suspicion. They never had. The confidence with which she had acted had no foundation in the documents governing her role. The formal complaints came in from multiple homeowners within the week. The board, now acutely aware that its own liability was entangled in Melissa's decision, launched a comprehensive review of enforcement procedures. Policies that had been vague enough to enable this kind of unilateral action were rewritten with specific language. Oversight requirements were added. The review process for any enforcement action involving physical entry to private property was formalized in ways that made improvised lock cutting categorically impossible to authorize. Melissa's tenure as president ended with a speed that reflected both the seriousness of what she had done and the community's collective recognition that small abuses of authority don't stay small when nobody pushes back on them. The cabin is unchanged. The lake still delivers exactly what I bought it for. The pine trees remain indifferent to HOA bylaws, which is one of their best qualities. The new lock on the front gate is substantially more serious than the one that was cut, installed with the specific satisfaction of a person who has learned something about security through direct experience. When people ask for my best HOA story, and once word got around, people did ask, I tell them about the president who was so convinced she would find a violation that she cut a lock to go looking for it, and instead found a group of authorized professionals who wanted to know exactly what gave her the right to be there. She had spent years telling homeowners what authority looked like. That afternoon, standing inside a property she had entered illegally, she got a very clear demonstration of what it actually requires. A title is not authority. Confidence is not authorization. And a bolt cutter, it turns out, is an extraordinarily poor substitute for a legal basis.